Color is everything. One thing that I've always really liked about studying color is how much color and light reveal about the nature of reality, or at least the way that we kind of process what we perceive from the world around us. Imagine you had to describe color to someone who's never experienced color, to someone that was born totally blind. What approach would you take to that? You could reference things in the world. The sky is blue, for example, the grass is green, but that doesn't really help in communicating what color looks like. You could do it by temperature. You could say reds are warm, blues are cool. But even if you could explain every physical attribute and association of color, could you ever fully describe the experience of color? Wouldn't there always be something missing? The nature of what that missing thing is something that philosophers have argued about throughout history, and it's at the core of understanding the nature of perception as it relates to the mind, the brain, and the body. Mary is a scientist. Her entire world is grayscale. She has never seen color. But Mary is obsessed with color. This is Mary's room. She's able to research color from a computer with a grayscale screen, and she has access to all possible information about what color is and how it works. If you ask Mary about a particular color, she can tell you everything about that color in more detail than anyone else on Earth. She is a world-class color expert. If you ask her about red, she can tell you that red is warm. Apples and fire hydrants are red. She can tell you all about the physiological response to red and why that response exists. Likewise, if you ask her about green, she can tell you that the chlorophyll in plant cells absorb all wavelengths of light except for green, which is reflected off. If you ask her about blue, she can describe the waveform of blue. She knows exactly what neurons fire in the brain when viewing blue. She can talk about blue shifting in stars. She knows that the sky is blue because of Rayleigh light scattering. Mary knows every fact that there is to know about every color. But if that's true, what happens when we do this? If Mary already knew literally everything there is to know about color, what is it that she learns when she is finally able to experience it? Mary's room is a thought experiment first proposed by Frank Jackson in an article called Epiphenomenal Qualia in 1982. Jackson's intent was to challenge physicalism and the completeness of a physiological approach to understanding the mind. Physicalism relies on the notion that everything in the universe, including mental experiences, can be physically described. And this has really been the predominant supposition for over a century in the natural sciences. But most people would agree that Mary learned something new when she saw blue for the first time. But how is that possible if she already knew every physical attribute that there is to know about the color? Jackson's argument is that in addition to the physical and scientific knowledge of color, there's information that can't be described in purely scientific terms. There's information that can't be learned or communicated through an intermediating device like language, and that information can only be gained through the experience of color. Jackson called this indescribable information qualia. If you imagine the color blue in your mind, where does that color exist in reality? Where does the mental experience of something fit into the physical reality? So when you imagine a color, you're recalling the qualia of the experience. And Jackson argues, since that does not exist physically, there must be a non-physical component to the brain, which can be distinguished here as the mind, which is just as real in terms of information as the physical description of things. Physicalists would argue that if Mary truly knew everything about a color in just an information sense, then she would be able to generate a mental image of that color, or that her knowledge could not have been considered complete without the experience of color, or that she learned the ability to see color, which is an ability that can be physically described. Non-physicalists would say that when Mary sees color for the first time, she gains the knowledge of the experience of color, which is an entirely mental thing that cannot be gained through the knowledge of objective facts. So you can apply this thought experiment to really anything that can be perceived with any sense. You could do it with sound, for example, but color is particularly useful here because color is light, and light is very fast. Light is roughly 1 million times faster than sound, which makes it much more useful for finding your way around in a 3D space. If we turn off all the lights in Mary's room, there are no more photons bouncing around, so our eyes have nothing to use to figure out that 3D space. As soon as we turn the lights back on, the light starts firing out photons again, and those photons shoot out in every possible direction and bounce off of every possible surface. As long as the light is on, all of these continuous streams of photons will continue bouncing around until all the waveforms of white light from the lamp or the light source or whatever are absorbed into some surface. Since the stream is continuous, what you end up with is like an infinitely dense field of light paths bouncing in every possible direction. That's how light works. If you just sit in this light field, your eyes will be bombarded with photons coming from every direction. Using the information contained in those light waves, your brain renders a 3D space, distinguishing between objects and things in your environment in terms of light color and depth. Light reflects off of surfaces, and the waveform of the light changes as a result of that reflection, creating the impetus for color. Our eyes pick up those waveforms, and your brain uses the information of the waveform to render reality visually. To illustrate how all that works, let's look at what happens when your eye has no information to work with. Let's look at Vantablack. Vantablack is the blackest black. It's made by a company called Surrey Nanosystems, specifically for use in microscope equipment. Some microscopy techniques rely on light reflecting off of a very specific part of the sample, or it relies on very specific light paths. But a lot of the time you also end up with a lot of unusable scattered light, which just makes the resulting image or data more fuzzy. So it's useful to have an apparatus to sort of catch the stray light. I believe that is why Vantablack exists. That's the only time I've seen it in person. The reason a black hole is black is because of its gravity. And gravity is the result of mass. Black holes have a lot of mass crammed into a relatively small area, which creates an effect where space bends dramatically as a result of the mass of the object. And this space is bending so dramatically that past a certain point, light can't travel fast enough, even at the speed of light, to escape the pull of the gravity of the object. Light is physically falling in and getting kind of sucked in and lost. And since no light is escaping and no light is reflecting off, the object appears black to our eye. Because when we have no data, no light data available, our eyes perceive black. Black is the absence of light, or the absence of color. Now, the way that paint normally works is you usually have 3 general components. This is also usually true for ink. You have pigment, a binder, and a solvent. The pigment is where you get color. This is generally some kind of ground-up mineral, like cadmium yellow or ultramarine blue. Titanium is white, carbon is black, etc. This is basically a powder. The binder is what stops the powder pigment from just rubbing off of a surface. It binds the pigment powder to the surface that it's being applied to. In oil paint, the binder is linseed oil, for example. Plastic polymers get used in acrylic paints. A binder is generally very thick, and it can be expensive, and would also take a very long time to cure and to dry. So to make them more workable and more practical, a binder is generally cut with some compatible solvent. Mineral spirits, or in other words, paint thinner, gets used with oil paint. Water is a thinner for acrylic paint because the acrylic binder is water soluble when it's still wet. The same with watercolor paint, obviously, is water soluble. The binder is gum arabic, which is water soluble. I believe Vantablack is a kind of acrylic paint, but instead of traditional pigment, Vantablack uses carbon nanotubes. So you have these tiny tubes that are randomly distributed, as a pigment would be, in the liquid medium of the binder and the solvent. So this is the secret to why Vantablack is so black. First of all, there is a traditional pigment there, sort of. Carbon is usually used as black pigment in paints and inks. Now what that means is the pigment of carbon absorbs all waveforms of light, but a lot of light can still reflect directly off the surface in the form of specularity. Vantablack combats that by creating a black hole-esque mechanism, but instead of using gravity, it uses carbon nanotubes to accomplish this. Light literally falls into these tiny black tubes, where it continues to bounce around until all wavelengths are absorbed. The light falls in, but it can't get back out. Or to be more precise, 99.9% of light can't get back out. Now you're probably thinking, how can I get my car painted in Vantablack? Well, there are a few problems with that. First of all of that light energy isn't simply lost. That's not really how thermodynamics work. It is converted into heat energy. So in direct sunlight, your car would look like the way it would look in a pitch black space, even in direct sunlight, but it would be getting increasingly hot inside. Also, Vantablack is pretty hard to get your hands on, although there are knockoffs available, I think, still maybe. I think only one artist is officially licensed by Surrey Nanosystems and allowed to use this specific kind of black, probably because of manufacturing costs and toxicity. I mean, sanding paint is pretty normal. Breathing in carbon nanotubes, probably not good for your lungs. Yeah. But there's one other problem with Vantablack that makes it particularly interesting if we're kind of looking at how color works. When something is painted in Vantablack, it looks flat. Now, if you ever shopped for spray paint, you know that spray paint is categorized by flatness. That's because the more specularity something has, the more dimension it appears to have. So flatter paints diffuse light over the surface more. They're more matte. Vantablack reflects no light. It's about as matte black as matte black gets, so it looks completely flat as a result. It sort of looks like somebody cut a 3D hole in space. Isn't that awesome? The reason it looks like this is because there's literally almost no visual data going back to your eye. Nothing is bouncing off the surface. So just like a black hole, since no light is allowed to escape, your brain has nothing to work with in terms of discerning like the actual depth of the 3D space. Because this is what we use light and color for, to create a mental image of the 3D space around us. If we were in a well-lit room, painted completely in Vantablack, we would not be able to distinguish the walls from the floor. I mean, if there were no waypoints like doors or windows, we would not be able to tell how big the room is either. If a line of cars were all painted in Vantablack, we would be relying purely on knowledge of form to be able to tell where one car stopped and the other started, because there would be no depth information to work with. We rely so much on reflected light to like find our way around. Vantablack can actually be kind of dangerous if it were used more widely. So black reveals a lot about how color works. First, color is in our mind, not in the world around us. All of the physical attributes of color exist in the world around us, but there's nothing about the waveform of blue, for example, that makes it blue. It only becomes blue once it is processed by our brain. It is a subjective experience. Secondly, our brain has evolved to use these physical attributes to render reality, to visualize the 3D space around us. The geometry is there, but the color, the way that everything looks, is only ever in your mind. Light waveforms. Here's another thought experiment. If a tree falls in a forest and nobody is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Almost everybody that I asked this question to really adamantly believes that it would, and you probably do too. I mean, people really don't like the idea that reality is being rendered as you move through it, and that the world disappears when you close your eyes. And that's not what happens. That's not what I'm saying. But it is useful to distinguish between the experience of sound and like the physical impetus for that experience. If a tree falls in the forest that is devoid of non-plant life, the tree would still be there, it would still fall, its leaves and branches would shift around, causing displacement in the air that creates an explosion of compression waves in the air that fire out in every direction. But these waves are just waves. They only become sound waves if an organism that can perceive sound is able to perceive them. By definition, sound requires a perceiver. If no such organism is present, these aren't exactly sound waves. I mean, why would they be? If an organism like a bat or a dolphin, for example, were present, it would perceive these same waves in a quasi-visual sense. The word sound references the experience of sound, the qualia, not necessarily the waves themselves. The waves are just anonymous waves. They're not automatically sound waves. Our brains are wired to use these sound waves to better navigate and respond to the environment. So it seems like the waves are coming from the world around you because they are. The physical impetus for the mental experience of sound is coming from the world around you. But that doesn't change the fact that the sound itself is only ever a mental experience. It's only ever happening internally. Light works the same way. Colors are waveforms of light, but instead of waves in a medium like air or water, light waves are tiny fluctuations in the electromagnetic spectrum, and that spectrum extends far past what is visible to the human eye. Rod and cone cells. Your eyes are kind of gatekeepers. They filter in some light, but leave out the vast majority of electromagnetic energy. Light can be physically described as fluctuations in this electromagnetic spectrum, so basically this means incredibly tiny waveforms. The electromagnetic spectrum stretches way past what we can see into infrared and X-rays. Our eyes are only tuned to a small part of this spectrum. And to understand why, we need to understand a little bit about evolutionary biology. In particular, we're going to talk a little bit about the retina. Your retina has over 100 million cells called photoreceptor cells. These cells generally take the form of either rod cells or cone cells. Rod cells have almost nothing to do with discerning colors, but you have way more rod cells than cone cells in your eye. Rod cells generally see grayscale and are responsible for peripheral vision and low light vision, which is why color becomes less vivid in lower lights. In particular, reds become less visible in lower lights because cone cells are more sensitive to bluer colored lights. The sort of imbluening of color in lower light situations is called the Purkinje effect. Cone cells are far less frequent and far less sensitive than rod cells, but this is where pretty much all of your color perception comes from. Humans are usually trichromatic, which means you have 3 different kinds of cone cells. You have cone cells that are tuned to redder waveforms of light, cone cells that are tuned to bluer waveforms of light, and cone cells that are tuned for waveforms closer to the middle part of the visible spectrum, so greenish. People who are red-green colorblind are dichromatic, which is sort of the way that a lot of other animals, like dogs, for example, see. But for most people, everything you see, including every color in the visible spectrum, is mentally formulated as a result of some combination of these 3 kinds of cone cells being activated in your retina by the corresponding waveforms bouncing off of things in the environment. So why these 3 cells? Well, there are a lot of potential explanations, but my favorite, because it's probably the simplest to understand, is that we are more able to see and distinguish between colors that would have been useful in the survival of pre-human ancestors. We can probably see red, for example, because blood is red. Hemoglobin in blood as heme, which functions as a red pigment in blood because of the iron in your blood. Iron is red. The iron in the heme absorbs all wavelengths of light except red, the red waveforms, which are reflected off. When a color is reflected off of something, we see that thing as the color that's being reflected. Being able to distinguish blood in the environment would have been massively advantageous in helping early mammals avoid a grisly death to predators. Another explanation is that these pre-human ancestors survived mostly off of fruits, and humans are particularly good at distinguishing between red and green because it makes it possible to detect the ripeness of fruits. Our eyes are most sensitive to red and green, and we perceive red and green as having perfect contrast, just like black and white. So this would help to distinguish red, ripe fruits from the undigestible greenery around them. So the cone cells in our eyes are tuned specifically for red. They're also tuned specifically for green, because all of nature is green. Chlorophyll in plant cells is magnesium-based, and as a result absorbs all wavelengths of light except green, which is reflected off, which is what makes nature look mostly green. Our ability to see green is really our ability to spot plant life. Blue is a little bit more complicated. If a culture has a word for vision, they almost always have words for dark and light. If a culture has words for color, they almost always have words for dark, light, and red. As I've said, it makes sense that red would be specifically important, and red is usually the most commonly identified color between languages and cultures, and the next most popular seems to be yellow or green. But some cultures don't really have a word for blue, and it's even been theorized that ancient Greeks didn't really have a word for blue, and therefore some people have taken this to indicate that blue vision is a relatively new adaptation to the human species. There's no particularly conclusive evidence either way, but just like red and green, it makes sense to be able to see blue. Although blue is a lot less frequent as a natural pigment, the sky is blue more than it is any other single color, and therefore water is reflecting blue more than any other single color. Just like red vision probably exists to detect blood or ripeness, and green vision exists to detect plant life, you could theorize that blue vision is a way to visually distinguish water. Now, if this set of colors sounds familiar, it's because they correlate to what we think of as the primary colors, which are usually taught as either red, yellow, and blue, or red, green, and blue. The primary colors are the colors that they are because that's literally how we see. The 3 primary colors directly correspond to the 3 kinds of cone cells in our eye. Of course, humans didn't know this when the primary colors were first being used by painters. They only knew that these colors seemed indivisible. You can create orange by mixing red and yellow, but how do you create red? Well, since the red cone cell cannot be subdivided, the color cannot be subdivided. Red is biologically indivisible. But the waveform that we perceive as red can obviously be divided and created by adding other waveforms together. Red is indivisible to our perception, but that doesn't really matter objectively. Color wheels are unnatural, but they are very useful tools. As far as I know, the first person in recorded history to create a color wheel was Newton. Newton looked at the rainbow and decided that it was made up of 7 colors. Of course, a rainbow is not made up of 7 colors. You can divide the rainbow into millions of colors, but Newton divided it into 7 because he liked 7. That's it. That's the actual reason. I think it was religious. I think it was a religious thing or something. Yeah. And Newton went on to make the first color wheel based on that. Primary colors and color gamut. The reason that the color wheel is a useful tool is because you can use it to figure out a color gamut, which is just all of the possible colors you can create from a given set of primary colors. So given the human biological primary colors that correspond to the cone cells in our eye, we can create a color gamut, which is just all of the possible ways those 3 colors can be mixed. If we mix violet, we mix red and blue pigment, and that activates the red and blue cone cells in our eye, which is mapped to the mental experience of the color purple in the environment. So color wheels are useful, but there are a lot of other ways to visualize the colors that we can perceive, like a single color's value and lightness, for example. But it's important to note that these are tools that humans created to communicate color. Color is not really a wheel. It's a spectrum. There is a narrow range that describes all of the things that we can see, the visible spectrum. And then there's lots of waveform information that we cannot see on either side of this spectrum. If our eye's cone cells were tuned to different frequencies of light, this visible spectrum would be different. We can't see things that are redder than red, but they would be infrared. Things that are bluer than violet or ultraviolet. Violet is actually an interesting color. Like blue, it's infrequent in nature. Almost nothing in nature is actually magenta, for example. We get magenta as a result of our color wheel. In nature, color is a spectrum with reddish colors at one end and bluish and purple colors at the other end. If we take that spectrum and bend it into a wheel shape, we create a situation where the violet end of the spectrum mixes with the red end of the spectrum, and magenta is created at this point. So that's how and why we perceive color. Color is a subjective experience. There's really no way for me to know if the colors I see are the same colors that you see. If I hold up an apple and state that this apple is red, what I mean is that this apple is the color that I've always called red. If you looked at the same apple, assuming it's a red apple, not a green apple or something, you would agree that the color is red for the same reason. It's the color that you've always called red. But the experience of color, the qualia that we generate when we perceive it, is completely isolated to the mind of the individual. If our color perception was shifted proportionally, we would never disagree about the color of things, even though we would be perceiving them totally differently. Do we actually perceive colors differently? Well, there's no reason to think we do. There are reasons, however, to think we don't. If we look at all of the animals on Earth, the similarities are striking, right? I mean, mostly 2 eyes, a nose, lungs, 2 ears, usually like 4 appendages, similar heart and other internal organs. We even have the same general photoreceptor cells in our eyes. We have rod and cone cells. There are differences. Cats rely more on rod cells for vision and have better night vision as a result. Dogs are missing the photoreceptor cells for red and green. Dogs would have no reason to distinguish between ripe fruit from the greenery around it, for example. So they see on a yellow and blue spectrum. They're dichromatic. But the basic physiology is the same. That's because all living things on Earth are related. Birds, humans, lizards, crabgrass, all distant relatives of each other genetically. Mammals share a lot of the same genetics. So then if you dig all the way down to where humans are all almost exactly the same. Isn't that nice? So you could say that color is probably intersubjective or subjective among a group. Although the qualia of color can't be accurately communicated with information, the space that we share is more than the colorless, silent geometry of the physical space. We live within a mental, virtual space that we all generate together and share. It would be impossible for humans to survive and thrive as a group or as a society if we didn't agree on the basic perception of the 3D space that we occupy together. So if nothing else, we usually agree on the colors that make up our world. And when we don't, people freak the out.